Ontario Premier Doug Ford says he approved the decision to open up protected Greenbelt lands to housing construction, and he takes full responsibility. It comes after Ontario's Auditor General issued a report that said the province's decision to do so favoured developers with connections to the Housing Minister's Chief of Staff. AG Bonnie Lysyk says the Ontario government also failed to consider the environmental, agricultural, and financial risks.
I want to be clear. We will not in any way entertain any proposals that would remove lands from the Greenbelt or open the Greenbelt lands to any kind of development.
2 years ago, Municipal Affairs and Housing Minister Steve Clark made that promise. Now, both he and Ontario Premier Doug Ford are facing the music after deciding to open 15 protected Greenbelt lands up to developers, facing harsh criticism today from the province's Auditor General.
Our review of the procedures used to amend the Greenbelt boundary in 2022 raises serious concerns about the exercise used, the way in which standard information gathering and decision-making protocols were sidelined or abandoned, and how changes to the Greenbelt boundaries were unnecessarily rushed through.
Bonnie Lysyk released a damning report today, saying her investigation found the Housing Minister's Chief of Staff favoured developers connected with 14 of the 15 land sites removed from the Greenbelt, calling the brief 3-week process used indefensible.
What followed cannot be described as a standard or defensible process. Even though hundreds of site removal requests had been submitted to the ministry in the 17 years since the establishment of the Greenbelt in 2005, the team only assessed 22 sites as options for removal from the Greenbelt, of which 21 were provided to them by the Housing Minister's Chief of Staff. Further, 2 prominent developers provided packages containing information about 2 of the Greenbelt land sites to the Housing Minister's Chief of Staff at a dinner function held by the Building Industry and Land Development Association in September 2022.
Ford owning up to the details laid out in the scathing report, saying he approved the decision to open up the Greenbelt and takes full responsibility, though he still stands behind his housing policy.
I approved it. At the end of the day, I take full responsibility for the process. But I can tell you, we have a housing crisis, the likes of which this province and this country has never seen before. Last year alone, Ontario grew by more than 500,000 people. Put that into perspective, the federal government brought in 1.1 million people into our country. 600,000 people landed everywhere else. But folks, guess what? Eventually, they're going to end up in Ontario.
We're joined now by Tim Gray, the Executive Director of Environmental Defence. Tim, Auditor General Bonnie Lysyk did not hold back in her report today. Do you agree with her conclusions?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's great to see some clarity and light brought to what happened with the Greenbelt.
Now, Ford has admitted to some fault over opening up the Greenbelt, but is this report merely a slap on the wrist? Is it too late for anything to be done about this decision now?
I think that the auditor's 3 main conclusions are really important for the Ontario public and should be important for the Ontario government as well. The first being that the political level of government directed particular lands to be removed from the Greenbelt that are going to have a massive benefit, windfall profits for selected developers that are very close to the provincial government. So it's really important to have that clarified. Secondly, that none of these lands that were removed from the Greenbelt were necessary to meet the housing targets that the Premier talks about all the time, or will do anything to address the very real housing affordability crisis we have in this province. And then lastly, that these lands should be returned to the Greenbelt. It's about 2 million acres of forests, wetlands, farmland, and it's meant to be permanently protected, so not ever get smaller. And it protects our water supply. It protects the headwaters of major rivers, streams, and creeks that flow off these highlands down towards Lake Ontario. And you can imagine in a time of growing climate risk, why it would matter so much to make sure that the headwaters of our rivers are not covered in concrete, because you've seen the consequences of the way that the weather's changing. So huge risk to all the people who live downstream in all of the cities and towns in the Greater Golden Horseshoe if the headwaters of these rivers become paved. Our lives are at risk, our properties are at risk. In addition, of course, as climate change wreaks havoc on global food systems, having the ability to grow food on some of the best farmland in the world that's close to our major cities and where we all live, that's incredibly important.
What environmental decisions should be taken into consideration as Ontario moves forward with its housing plans?
Yes, so housing, we know, is going to be most affordable and most desired to live in if it's located within existing towns and cities. And I can give you a really good example of this, is that neighborhoods kind of like near where I live in downtown Toronto and the Trinity Bellwoods, the Little Italy area. And that neighborhood is moderate density, mostly single family homes, some duplexes, townhomes, those kind of things. Lots of parks, lots of green space, lots of restaurants nearby, services. And if we developed all of the land that's already been designated for housing in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, if we developed at that density, which is not high density, they're not towers there, these aren't like monster buildings, only 20% of the land that's already designated, without ever touching the Greenbelt, would be consumed to house all the people that are going to move to this region by 2051. But also it's an anchor to our overall land use planning system. This is the area we don't develop in, and it's meant to encourage building more homes in cities and towns where it's cheaper in terms of taxes to provide services, where people can walk to work, take transit to work, be close to schools and their jobs and services and their friends.
Thanks so much for joining us, Tim.
Thanks for having me.